Milltown Minutes is a companion web series to the upcoming feature-length film Milltown, directed and produced by Genevieve Belcher. Milltown focuses on the small town of West Warwick in Kent County, Rhode Island. As part of what is known as the Pawtuxet Valley, West Warwick played a major role in the Industrial Revolution alongside its neighbors, Warwick and Coventry. The following Milltown Minutes video gives a glimpse into the rich history of this area.
Slavery, as in the African American sense, there wasn't any. It had been abolished by the end of the Revolution. If you were born after a certain date, I think it was like 1784, you were considered free. If you were born before 1784, you were considered a slave until you reached a certain age, and your master then would give you what was called manumission. Of course, you have, if you really think about the term of slavery, mill workers. They were enslaved to the mill because you lived in a house that was owned by the mill. You went to a church that was owned by the mill. You shopped in the mill store. You didn't have a right to vote because most of the time, immigrants were not, they weren't considered naturalized. Even some of the native-born people couldn't vote because they didn't have the right amount of property. The concept of voting in Rhode Island is based on English law. You had to be a free white male of a certain age, own X number of property, to be what was classified a freeman and be able to vote. And that was something that was brought over in the 1600s. When they set up Schwammet Purchase in 1642, they laid out the land, and they had what was called the proprietors. And these were the guys that, they deeded the land to. It was a group of men, and then you would go to those people and you would get buy land from them. And that land would then be passed down, usually to the oldest son. So the oldest son in all the families didn't have to go before town council to be considered get voting rights. Because he usually got double share of his father's estate. So he had enough property to be a voter. It was his younger brothers who had to go and find out if they could become voters. And get them or buy enough property to become a voter. Usually, that's why people moved around and left.
The argument about property requirement related to voting was a hot topic even when the Founding Fathers were setting up the Constitution. To quote History.org, the range of disputes was too vast and too complex to cover in depth in this space. The chief concerns, however, focused on extending voting rights to veterans, the implications of a broader electorate, and the validity of property requirements. Property requirements seemed to attract the most attention.
And that continued on, that system was continuing all the way into the 1840s, where you were going up and you were, approaching town council and asking for the right to vote, or, proving that you had the right to vote because of who your father was, which kept immigrants from voting, because they couldn't buy the land, and the ones that were the younger sons either went to sea, became soldiers, or they went, started and went to work in the factories, which meant you rented a home from the mill owner, so you didn't acquire enough property to vote. And that would eventually change with Thomas Wilson Dorr and what was called the Dorr Rebellion.
As a Harvard-educated attorney from an old blue blood Rhode Island family, Thomas Wilson Dorr was an unlikely leader for the working man's voting rights, but it was something he felt strongly about. So strongly did he feel that he later suffered exile, imprisonment, illness, and finally death. While every other state in the nation had revised voting laws, 60% of Rhode Island's population was ineligible to vote. He tried to change the voting laws in Rhode Island by leading a movement and becoming elected the People's Governor. He and his followers created the People's Constitution and put it to a vote. In December 1841, the people voted overwhelmingly in favor of the People's Constitution. For 6 weeks, there were two rival governments, during which time there were two governors, Dorr and Samuel Ward King. King eventually overthrew Dorr and his followers.
As a result of his little rebellion, they did change the voting rules. But it still was only free white males. You would then see by the end of the Civil War, with the passing of the 14th Amendment, you would see, where African Americans could start to vote. And then, would also, you then see with the suffrage acts, you see women starting to get the right to vote. Immigrants, once they were able to acquire the property, they could then eventually start voting too. Mills also played a big part of that too, because the mill owner could sometimes influence who you were voting for. Because if they wanted a particular candidate, it was known that they would meet you at the voting place and help you vote. As the mill owner owned everything, and I'm going to use an analogy. It's like being a serf, back in England, one of those, the feudal manors, where they owned everything. The lord owned everything, and you were subject. So he could tell you he didn't want you to work in his mill anymore. He could raise the rent where you couldn't afford it. If you did something that he didn't like, if you spoke out against it. So organization of labor unions and strikes. There were strikes in the 1820s, but you were risking being blackballed from work. So as the unions developed and were able to get stronger, it took a lot of, and the people got the right to vote. It took away the power of the mill owner, because then you could say, I'm not working, without fear of losing your job or your life or your home.